In the 1930s, a man named Adolf Hitler started to come to power in Germany. He started to come to political power. He started to rise through the ranks, and he was selling this ideology of a greatest group of people, a greatest race. And he wanted to be the pinnacle of all human history. And so what he started to do, even as he was raging war, even as he was trying to exterminate the Jewish people, he started to compile things. He started to take priceless art and artifacts, historical documents, historical monuments, store them up in a place like this. This is an estate home in the middle of nowhere, Germany. Those piles are priceless paintings that you're not even allowed to touch at the museum. They have them stacked up to the ceiling. He wanted all of it. Another random house, I think in Austria, with a whole museum's worth of art, just in a side room. Mines and caves, well, they're damp and not great places to keep these things, stored away, because he had a vision. He had a vision that when he ruled the world, he would open the greatest museum ever that would have every important artifact in it, every important piece of art in it. And he would deem what's important. So he would get to rewrite human history. He would destroy what didn't line up with what he thought. He would erase civilizations that he thought were unworthy before him. So not only was he compiling art, not only was he taking monuments and historical documents, he was destroying a lot of them, trying to erase that history. And so the Americans and the British came together and they formed the MFAA, the Monuments and Fine Arts Archive. You may have seen the movie or read the book Monument Men. If you've not, and you like World War II movies, it is very good. 400 people in total came together. It was a collection of professors and museum curators and collectors of expensive things, soldiers and spies and art critics. They used networks to find where these were. They used these critics and professors. If you can imagine being an art history professor, and they say, we need you to fly into Germany in the middle of World War II and tell us if these paintings we found in the house are real. This is what they set out to do. Because yes, lives were being lost, but history was at stake. He was trying to erase people entirely out of human history. And so the Monument Men, or the MFAA, they saved 5 million pieces of art and historical artifacts. 5 million. And that's just the ones they saved. They think Hitler took somewhere between 7 to 8 million pieces of art and historical artifacts. But this is not the first time that this happens or the last time. People in power try to erase history, erase people's stories. In 2014, ISIS started bombing monuments in Iraq and Syria. This is a before and after picture. They stole things to sell them, and what they couldn't steal, they just destroyed. They wanted to rewrite history. They wanted to play God. We decide who's talked about. We decide who's not. This is a former ancient structure, the pillars that stood place in Syria since ancient times, that they just blew up just because they could. This is the story of the power of man trying to control history. Thankfully, we've been able to save some of these things. If you ever get a chance and you're in Chicago to go to the Oriental Institute, I highly recommend it. It's a little museum, but it's ran by the University of Chicago. This is one of their rooms. You can see the people to the scale size of those sheer massive walls. Those walls they brought over from Iraq in 1930 in one piece. They have a room on Babylon, a room on Assyria. You can walk and touch the wall where the exiles went in the Old Testament. They preserved this history because it's important. But that centerpiece is really important for our discussion this morning because it's a big statue of a guy named Sargon II. Now, Sargon II is the king of Assyria who finally sacked Samaria and took the northern kingdom into exile. His father started for 20 years stealing things, stealing people, paying heavy taxes. His older brother surrounded Samaria for 3 years and couldn't get the job done. So his younger brother supplanted him. And in 722, Sargon II sacked Samaria. He sieged it. We get this in Isaiah 20. Sargon is actually mentioned in scripture. It says, in the year that the supreme commander sent by Sargon, king of Assyria, came to Ashdod and attacked, and he captured it. So think, if you will, your civilization is completely taken over by another one. A king, a tyrant has come in, and he's going to do what Hitler did. He's going to do what ISIS did. He's going to erase history. He's going to take what he wants, plunder what he wants, burn to the ground what he wants. Sargon II in 722 came in and he sacked Samaria. Then something happened. God intervened in a way that's remarkable. An unnamed editor. We have no idea who they were. We're pretty sure they're from the southern kingdom of Judah. An unknown editor was able to go in through all the chaos and all the mess and compile a collection of writings by a man named Hosea, and flee to the southern kingdom and piece them together that we might have them, because his story was one that we need to hear. We almost lost the book of Isaiah, or the book of Hosea, to war, to siege. We almost lost it before it was ever written. Sargon II almost succeeded in just wiping away this very important message that we need to hear even to this day. So we're gonna walk through Hosea together the next 10 weeks in a sermon series that we're calling Hosea, I Will Love Them Freely. And some of you may be familiar with the story, right? The object lesson part of him and his wife. But I don't know if a lot of us know that that's 3 chapters of a 14-chapter book. It's not just the story of him and his wife. See, this editor, he was able to piece together basically sermon manuscripts and poems. And not only that, but quotes that other people had given him that Hosea had said. And he pieced it all together into this one collection, right? This is a collection of the greatest main works of Paul Tillich, who's one of the most influential theologians of the last 100 years, right? Somebody took the time and energy to compile this into these books so that I don't have to go buy 40 of his books and look up PDFs all over the internet, right? This was seen as an act of love because it's a message we needed. We owe a great debt of servitude to this unnamed editor who put together the book of Hosea, who saved it. But we need to understand a few things. So today we're going to kind of frame Hosea. We're going to get ourselves ready to dig in for the next 9 weeks. It reads awkwardly. The people who know a lot about the Bible, who know way more than I will ever know, they say it's the most poorly put together book of the Bible. What they mean by that is some guy who didn't write it had most of the pieces of a puzzle and said, I think I can get the point across with this. So it's mixtures of sermons and poems and quotes pieced in together. Hosea talks in first person on behalf of God. Then he talks in third person about God. The story's about him, and then he's telling the story. It's not always easy to find. It's not always easy to follow. But it's really vitally important because it sends a message that we need to hear. So the book of Hosea is kind of odd. It's weird. And to prove that, we are starting our series on Hosea with the very last verse of the entire book. The very last verse of Hosea is Hosea 14:9 is the editor's note. We believe from what we've studied that everything before this is the words of Hosea compiled by somebody else. But 14:9 is the editor's note. The guy who made the collection, who saved this, says this: who is wise? Let them realize these things. Who is discerning? Let them understand. The ways of the Lord are right. The righteous will walk in them, but the rebellious stumble in them. This is a note that he put at the very end of the book. If you're like me, you read Hosea and you think, man, this guy did a great service to us, but why couldn't he have put this at the start of the book? I kind of needed this reminder before I got into the book, but we'll get to, I think, why it's at the end. He did a great service to us in making this editor's note. And when we talk about scripture, we need to talk about it on two levels. There's always the immediate context, who's the author and their immediate audience, and then how do we interact with it. So the editor's note was most likely because someone in the Southern Kingdom thought, we need to hear about the things that this northern prophet did. We need his words, that we wouldn't follow the same mistakes of the Northern Kingdom. We know from scripture that unfortunately they did. And sometime later, Babylon came in and took the Southern Kingdom away into exile. But the editor's notes serve a larger purpose, not just for those in Judah, but for all of us. And that purpose is fourfold. We're going to unpack it this morning. The first purpose that this verse, single verse, does is that it tells us to take notice. It says that the wise will see there's a deeper meaning here. It's deeper than it appears. The discerning will seek the true meaning. He puts it at the end so that if you've read it and you are someone who wants to be wise, if you're someone who considers themselves to be discerning, you'll start to think, did I read it thoroughly? Did I just breeze through it? What is my takeaway? This points the reader toward a careful reading. It's not a story to be read for enjoyment. I like to read. I have lots of book recommendations. If you're looking for a fun Saturday read, Hosea is not one I'm going to suggest to you. It's not a feel-good book. And it's not one that it should be just on this list that you should read it just because, right? A couple years ago, my wife started this endeavor of watching all the movies that the really smart critics say you should watch before you die, just so that you're like a cultured person, right? And I got to admit, most of them I didn't like very much. But Hosea is not a book that you should just have read. So you've read, the Odyssey, you've read The Catcher in the Rye, you've read Hosea, you're cultured. It's not about getting information. It's never simple. It's rarely direct. Like I said before, it switches genres and first-person, third-person perspective often. But if you're wise, you'll dig in deeper. You ever heard the saying, someone is wise beyond their years? Why do we say that? Why can't a young person just be wise? I think it's because wisdom takes time. If somebody is young and they're wise, we say they're wise beyond their years because life gives us perspective the farther we go. Someone who is wise beyond their years is wiser than someone their own age, seems to have more experience, more perspective than someone their own age. If a wise person or someone who seeks to be wise reads this editor's note, they think to themselves, am I getting it? I remember my grandpa used to tell me all the time, there are smart people that know what they know, and then there are wise people who know what they don't know. Wisdom is about knowing what you don't know. And this editor's point is, did you think you got it? Read the whole book, and then do you think you actually got what the point was? You must admit to yourself that maybe you need to reread it, that you didn't get everything out of it. But the first step is acknowledging that there is something bigger to get out of it, that there's a profound reason why this was saved from Sargon II and destruction. So wisdom comes with time, but this editor points us back to a second reading and probably a third and a fourth reading of the same text. Hosea, again, like I said, not a fun read, but it's one of those ones where every time you read it, you're like, I did not catch that before. This is something, if we read it slowly and intentionally, that we get to see the ways of God laid out in a unique way. The second fold of this editor's note is that it tells us it's about God, right? The ways of the Lord are the central emphasis. It would be easy for us to read it and say it's a story about either a guy named Hosea or a story about a people group that he sometimes calls Ephraim, he sometimes calls Jacob. But the editor wants us to know, no, it's about God. So when we read it, as we unpack this together over the next 9 weeks, what is God doing the whole time? How are his ways evident? We'll be talking about a guy, we'll be talking about a country, but we need to know that we're supposed to be focusing on what God's doing, that his ways will become clear to us. This points the reader away from a self-centered reading. Because so often stories, especially shows and movies, are written in a way to where the hero is supposed to be relatable because you would like to be the hero. You want to be the hero of the story, so they want a hero that you relate with. But in this story, we relate with the antagonist, not the protagonist, and it makes it a little harder to read at times. It's about God. So if I didn't make that point clear enough, it's not about you. It's an interesting way of looking at it, but it's one that we need to take on. We aren't meant to identify with Hosea or emulate him, right? We're not supposed to say, what would Hosea do? For Hosea's character points us to truths about God and not necessarily what we're called to do. If we tried to apply his life directly to ours, there would be some awkward inconsistencies. Knowing God is a key concept in the book of Hosea. We talked about this in Romans. It's in 1 Corinthians as well. Paul brings this one verse up every time he talks about how the church works together. He says, "For I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings." This is a book about knowing God and knowing his ways. It's not about us. It's about God. The third fold that this one verse, this editor's note gives us, is that the righteous will walk in the ways of the Lord. So there's an example being set. We're not meant to try to do what Hosea did, but we are meant to glean what God did and then react accordingly. The acknowledgement that God's ways are right and that he is loving should cause a reaction. They are discernibly different than our own. As we read this, we will see time and time again, man, if I were God, I would not have done this. If I were God, I surely would have quit on them by now. If I were Hosea, who's emulating God in this story, I would have walked out a long time ago. There's a discernible difference, an example set between the ways of God and the ways of man. This points the reader away from an unmoved reading and towards repentance. So you can misread something, you can misinterpret something, you can miss the point, or you can read it, know entirely what it means, and just go, and move on with your life. This editor's note is there that we wouldn't have an unmoved reading. Acknowledging the goodness of God, his ways, should evoke some sort of response out of us. The fourth thing that the editor's note, that 14:9 tells us, is that there's some fault of our own to be faced in this story. The rebellious will stumble in the ways of the Lord, is the last line. It's not just a cautionary tale, right? Think back to all the stories that we tell to our kids. I was thinking about this week. A lot of them are basically don't lie. We talked about the boy who cried wolf, right? Don't lie. Here's a story. Here's a moral of the story. We told the boy who cried wolf a little different to my generation. We called it Larry Boy and the Rumor Weed, right? Through Veggie Tales. But again, the point was, don't lie. There's not like a go out and do it 1 point moral of the story here. It's not just that history will repeat itself. It's not that if we read Hosea, we just won't do what Israel did. We already have done what Israel did. We have to face our own faults when we read this book. It makes it really hard to read at times. It's not just an avoidance of wrong, it's an admission that we have done wrong things towards God. This points the reader towards a self-critical read in light of God's long-suffering love. Let me read that again. This points the reader towards a self-critical read in light of God's long-suffering love. 2 weeks ago, I stood up here with a blind spot mirror and talked about how the Bible is technology. We have to understand how to use it. We must use it to be self-critical of ourselves. We should use God's love to contrast what we are doing that we might be better. This is not a revivalist turn or burn. I can tell you how bad you are over and over again and it'll click. This is look how good God is. And if we appreciate and acknowledge it, we'll see what we've done in light of God, not in light of what we've done. So it's not merely history will repeat itself. There's fault of our own to be read into this story. And I'm not going to lie to you, it's a tough read, right? People will misunderstand it. People will purposely avoid the true meaning of it because it's really difficult. They'll struggle to justify their own interpretations. People do some weird things with Hosea. But the elephant in the room, the thing that's going to be really kind of difficult for some of us to deal with as we unpack this, there's no way around it. The text calls us whores. There's no other way around getting through that the main imagery of this book is that you and I are whores. That's uncomfortable. That's not a title we want. It's not something we want said about us. But that's what makes it such a tough read. That's why it's not a pleasant Saturday afternoon read. It shows us our sin, shows us our faults, shows us our whoredom, and uses strong words in doing it. So as we frame Hosea, as we figure out how to attack it, a few things that we've learned from this editor. It must be a slow and a careful reading. We must watch for what God is doing throughout. We should ask ourselves, how would we react in that situation, or how do we react in that situation, that we might see how God's ways are better than our own. And we must face the tough parts with both accountability. We have to own what we did, but also with the grace of God, knowing that the story is about the long-suffering love of God and not about the bad stuff we've done. And the last thing is that we need to read it in context. And so, again, it's an odd book. We read the very last verse. To get context, we're going to read just the very first verse. So we bookend this book today. Hosea 1:1 says this: "The word of the Lord that came to Hosea, son of Beri, during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, who were the kings of Judah, and during the reign of Jeroboam the second, son of Jehoash, king of Israel." It's not a very long introduction. It actually tells us more about when he lived and who the kings were than about him, right? Once we get past the early narrative, the first 3 chapters, we actually stop even hearing the word Hosea. He starts talking through God's voice in first person often. We get first and foremost in the context of the man, right? So one of the interesting tidbits about Hosea is that his name means salvation, which is a great name for a prophet, right? Because he is one who's saying, look, these bad things are coming, but always with a message of salvation on the back end of it. But the weird thing that we get about him is that we have no hometown given. We have no trade or profession given. We have no backstory. We don't know where he's from. We don't know what he did. We don't really know a lot about him. They give us his dad's name. Not even what clan he was from, not what portion or region he was from. But we get his name, which means salvation. And then I think it's very purposeful that he is just kind of transparent and blends into the story. It's not about him. We talk about him, but it's not about him. He is simply a message of salvation. And so we get no deeper look into his backstory. But what we do get is the opposite. With most prophets, we hear like, hey, this is where they came from. This is what they did before they were a prophet. And then this is what they said. With Hosea, we get, and there was a guy named Hosea, and then we get a super deep look into his home life. We get to see how he treated his wife and his children. We get to look into the moral decisions he had to make in his life, which is something we don't really get out of many of the other prophets. So the context of the book is largely the man, right? Then you have the role that he plays. He is both a mouthpiece of God and an object lesson. Now, I'm sure most of us are familiar with the object lesson. We'll unpack that over the next couple of weeks. But as a prophet, he was the mouthpiece of God. He delivered God's message. And that message was very, very often, you've done it again. Hey, look, you did it again. I told you that you would do it again, and you did it again. But God is faithful. God is long-suffering. He is still here. But the thing that's so kind of jarring about Hosea, it's difficult to read at times, is that he has to be God in the analogy. Think about that for a second. When we read Parable of the Lost Son, right? The son runs away, comes back. We read it. We're supposed to identify with the son, or if we're an older Christian and we're struggling, sometimes the older son, right? The second brother, but never the dad, right? The dad is God, and it's not based on a real person, it's a metaphor. He has to play the role of God in the analogy. He has to uphold what God would do in a very, very tough circumstance. So he has to not only be the mouthpiece of God, but he has to play the role of God in the analogy. He has to live that out. And think about that for a second, that not only does he have to live it out, it's then recorded and passed down for the rest of human history. It's a lofty bar that he lives up to. We also know that more than likely he lived to see Samaria sieged. Jeremiah wrote at the end of the southern kingdom, and then he wrote the book of Lamentations about watching the southern kingdom fall. We know that the writings of Hosea basically end right at the siege. We think maybe he was killed during the siege, carried off. Whatever it was, we know that this man preached for a very, very long time, that he had to live out a really difficult life as an example of God's love to other people. God asked him to do something difficult that others might see how good God is. And then we know that it didn't sink in for his original audience. They didn't listen. That sits at the core of this idea that he, for the longest time, was preaching something to them, and he watched them do exactly what he warned them not to do. This is the context of the book of Hosea. The main message is the long-suffering love of God. We will go back and look at some of the history of the Old Testament, of the history of the Israelites. And we will go back and look at what they're doing right now in that story, how they got to where they were. He really lays out the history well to prove the point that if you were God, you would have given up on you a long time ago. But praise be to God that God is better. There's a longevity in his message that ties to that same message of long-suffering God. We believe that he was probably around preaching for 30 to 50 years, which makes him most likely the longest serving prophet in the Old Testament. So for years and years and years. Again, think if you poured 50 years of your life into something that didn't pan out from your perspective. I mean, we get to benefit from it greatly, but he never got to see the repentance of his country. He never got to see them turn away. He got to see Assyria come in and to take everything. So the message is the long-suffering love of God. The setting is in the northern kingdom. When he starts his message, he's talking through the phases of Uzziah and Jeroboam II. They're both very strong kings. Everything's going well. The guy in charge of Assyria is kind of a pushover. Everything seems to be going okay, so no one listens to him. But we see as we get to the end, we have Ahaz and Hoshea, who are horrible kings. They're ineffective. They're weak. They're puppet kings for Shalmaneser and for Sargon II. So it shifts, right? The bad guys are now more powerful. The good guys are weak and ineffective. Nobody is listening to him this entire time. If you've read Amos, he's speaking at the same time as Amos. Same time as Isaiah and Micah are in the southern kingdom. I'm going to do some reading this week. 2 Kings 14 through 17 tells the story of what's happening during the lifetime of Hosea. But we see this shift again of the long-suffering love of God portrayed by a prophet who has to see his loved ones make the same mistakes over and over and over again and keep coming to them with the same message. Yes, that sounds familiar. Absolutely. Right? The one big thing, we take nothing else away from this morning, take away this. The long-suffering love of God is a timeless and a powerful truth. It was saved by the anonymous editor because we need to hear about it now. It was saved by the anonymous editor because it was timeless and powerful for the southern kingdom, even though they didn't listen. It was saved by the anonymous editor that we might get a chance to be wise and discerning and actually glean this. That God is a long-suffering, loving God. That we were not just a little bad to God. We were way worse to God than we would ever have taken on our end of it. That he just constantly came back over and over and over and over again. So the one big thing is the long-suffering love of God is a timeless and a powerful truth. And we'll unpack that as we go through Hosea together. This is the part where we usually say, like, how do we do this, right? It's probably the most simple application of a sermon you're going to get from me ever. Read Hosea this week. Go home, take the time to slowly, diligently read Hosea that we can unpack it together. Reread it every week. Read it once a week. Sit down and read Hosea while we're in this series. But remember to frame it properly. Slow and careful reading. Watch for what God is doing while you're reading the book. Ask how we would have done it differently or how we would have reacted differently than God did. Face the tough parts, the parts that call us whores and unworthy, that say that we just keep turning away over and over again. With accountability, we have to own that, but we also have to know that grace is there. And then we need to remember the context of the story as we read through it. Remember the man who was trying to live out this, right? He had to walk what he talked, and he did a pretty good job in doing that. So we unpacked a book saved from destruction, put together by a guy who didn't write it, and left us one verse at the end. But that one verse, it's kind of everything. It points us to the point of the book. And that is that God's long-suffering love is timeless, effective, important. So this week, beloved, simply read Hosea. Will you pray with me?